What began as Ellie Morgan's impulsive decision to salvage an abandoned mail truck from certain destruction would expose a secret that 3 presidential administrations had spent decades to protect from public knowledge. The catastrophic mountain landslide that had threatened one vehicle's existence now served as the perfect cover for a government operation unlike anything the quiet community of Pine Ridge Valley had ever witnessed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ellie stood at her cabin window, steaming coffee forgotten in her weathered hands as she counted the 13th black SUV rolling through her gates. The modest homestead that her grandmother had carved from the unforgiving Colorado wilderness now resembled a secured government facility rather than the struggling sheep farm it had been just 24 hours earlier. "I don't understand any of this, Scout," she said to the aging Australian shepherd pressing anxiously against her leg. The dog whined softly, reflecting his owner's growing unease as uniformed personnel established a perimeter around the old barn, where last night's mysterious discovery now rested. The historic summer storms that meteorologists had dubbed the Centennial Deluge had brought record rainfall and deadly flash floods to Pine Ridge Valley, washing out roads and overwhelming emergency services. Local authorities had issued strict evacuation warnings, closing access points and advising residents to seek higher ground at all costs. Ellie had spent the day reinforcing her livestock shelters and digging drainage trenches, preparing her small flock for the worst of the weather still to come. It was during her final check of the Eastern Ridge Trail, where landslides often threatened her property, that she'd spotted the partially buried vehicle at first. Ellie had thought it was just another boulder dislodged by the rain. Only when Scout began barking frantically and pawing at the mud did she realize it was the roof of a truck, somehow washed down from the mountain road above and lodged precariously on the hillside. Getting to the vehicle had been a grueling ordeal. The ground was treacherously unstable, each step threatening to trigger another slide. The relentless rain made visibility poor, but something about the faded markings on the roof compelled Ellie forward. When she finally reached it, her breath caught. It was an old Postal Service truck, its weathered paint barely visible beneath decades of grime and new mud. What was most surprising wasn't its presence, but its age. This wasn't a recent accident. The vehicle looked like it had been buried for decades, only now exposed by the force of the storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't the truck's age or condition that had triggered this military response. It was the contents sealed within the rusted metal containers Ellie had discovered when she managed to pry open the rear doors. As Ellie had chipped away at the hardened mud sealing the vehicle shut, she discovered several anomalies that initially confused her but now seemed ominously significant given the government's reaction. Ellie's fingers unconsciously traced the peculiar seal. She'd found embossed on one of the containers an intricate pattern with an eagle at its center, unlike any government marking she'd ever seen. The same symbol that had caused the first official to visibly pale when Ellie mentioned it during her pre-dawn phone call to the county sheriff. The truck's cargo had been minimal standard mail bags long since deteriorated, a few waterproof containers that had somehow survived intact, and a small leather messenger bag with brass fixtures that had immediately struck Ellie as unusual. Despite being recovered from decades of burial, the leather remained supple, the brass tarnished but unbroken. Inside she'd found letters, dozens of them, each sealed in wax, each bearing the same distinctive presidential seal that matched the containers. During those desperate hours working to secure the truck before the hillside gave way completely, Ellie had noticed other peculiarities. The vehicle identification numbers had been filed off. The registration documents in the glove compartment were clearly forgeries, good ones, but with dates that didn't match the truck's apparent age. And strangest of all, a small metal plate bolted to the inside of the doorframe bore what appeared to be coordinates, written in a numeric system she didn't recognize. Now that simple discovery had escalated into something far beyond Ellie's comprehension. The government convoy included specialized vehicles bearing insignia she didn't recognize, and personnel establishing positions around her property wore uniforms without standard branch identifications. Several were unloading equipment that looked more appropriate for a classified operation than a postal recovery mobile scanning devices. What appeared to be signal jammers and equipment for secure communications. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder overhead, adding to the surreal transformation of her isolated family farm. A sleek black helicopter bearing no markings settled into her east pasture, the downdraft creating swirling vortices in the freshly saturated ground. From the aircraft emerged a tall woman in civilian clothes, her bearing unmistakably military despite the lack of uniform. She strode purposefully toward the house flanked by two armed escorts whose expressions betrayed nothing as their eyes continuously scanned the surroundings. Scout remained at Ellie's side, his normally friendly demeanor replaced with wary vigilance. As the woman approached the porch, Ellie stepped outside, determined to get answers about why her act of civic duty had apparently triggered a national security response. "Ms. Morgan," the woman called as she reached the steps. "I'm Director Catherine Hayes, National Archives Special Collections Division. Thank you for meeting me outside. It simplifies certain protocols." Ellie nodded cautiously, noting how Hayes's escorts positioned themselves to maintain clear sight lines across her property. "Doesn't seem like I had much choice, Director. Your people have surrounded my home." "A precautionary measure, I assure you," she replied with practiced neutrality. "The situation requires certain security parameters that may seem excessive, but are entirely warranted given the circumstances." "And what situation would that be?" Ellie asked, her patience wearing thin. "I found an old mail truck about to be buried in a landslide and called it in. Since when does recovering lost mail warrant a military occupation?" Something flickered across Director Hayes's face, a momentary break in her professional mask that might have been respect, or perhaps concern. "Ms. Morgan, the vehicle you recovered is not what you think. For your safety and national security, I need you to brief me on everything that occurred from the moment you found it until our arrival." "Not what I think?" Ellie repeated, confusion mounting. "It's a mail truck that went missing, probably decades ago based on its condition. I spotted it during the storm, managed to secure it before the entire hillside collapsed, and called the sheriff when I found those sealed containers with government markings." Director Hayes studied her carefully. "Did you open any of the containers or examine their contents in any way?" Ellie hesitated, recalling her careful examination of the truck's cargo. "The leather bag wasn't locked. I opened it to look for identification, to figure out who I should contact. The letters inside were still sealed. I didn't open any of them." "And the metal containers? The ones bearing the presidential seal?" "I tried, but couldn't get them open. They have some kind of combination lock system I've never seen before. Not digital, but not a standard tumbler either." The director's posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. "What about the documentation? The registration papers, logbooks, anything else you might have found in the cab?" A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept up Ellie's spine. There was a rooting manifest. Destinations, all government buildings by the looks of them. Dates from the summer of 1963, but the truck itself couldn't be that old. The model is wrong. And the driver's credentials. The photo doesn't match the name. I could tell that much even with the water damage. Instead of answering directly, Hayes handed her an official document, a temporary non-disclosure agreement with severe penalties prominently displayed in the opening paragraph. "Before we proceed further, I need your signature acknowledging that everything from this point forward is classified at the highest level." Ellie stared at the document, the surreal quality of the morning intensifying. The simple act of helping to salvage a piece of history had somehow entangled her in something far beyond her understanding, something significant enough to bring federal assets streaming to her isolated property within hours of her call to the sheriff. As raindrops began falling again from the heavy gray sky, Ellie made a decision that would forever alter her understanding of her nation's history and her place in it. She took the offered pen and signed, committing herself to whatever extraordinary revelation waited on the other side of her signature. "Now," she said, handing back the signed document, "tell me what I really found in that landslide." Director Hayes gestured toward Ellie's front door. "We should continue this conversation inside, Ms. Morgan. Some matters are better discussed away from open spaces and potential listening devices." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Listening devices on my farm? We're 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. Distance is no longer the barrier to surveillance it once was," Hayes replied cryptically, her eyes scanning the tree line beyond Ellie's property. "And given what I'm about to share with you, privacy is essential." Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Ellie's home felt suddenly unfamiliar with the director's presence. The worn wooden table where 3 generations of Morgan women had taken their meals now served as an impromptu security briefing station as Hayes removed a slim tablet from her jacket. "What I'm authorized to tell you is limited," she began, activating the device with her thumbprint. "But given your direct contact with the vehicle and its contents, you're entitled to certain information for your own safety." The tablet projected a 3-dimensional holographic display above the kitchen table, technology far beyond anything Ellie had seen outside of science fiction. The image showed a detailed timeline spanning from 1961 to 1964, with a series of redacted entries highlighted in pulsing red. On November 12, 1963, 10 days before President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, a specialized courier vehicle departed Washington, D.C. carrying sealed communications between the White House and specific military installations across the western United States. Hayes manipulated the display, zooming in on a route map that included a point not far from Ellie's property. The vehicle and its driver disappeared somewhere in this region. Despite an intensive search operation, no trace was ever found. The official record states that the truck was caught in a flash flood and presumed destroyed with all contents lost. Ellie stared at the pulsing visualization, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "But that's not what happened." "No, Ms. Morgan, it isn't. The materials you discovered were never meant to be lost, much less found 60 years later by a civilian." Hayes adjusted the display again, revealing documents stamped with eyes only and bearing presidential seals from the Kennedy administration. The letters and containers you recovered contained directives and contingency plans, drafted in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. Plans for a complete governmental restructuring should tensions with the Soviet Union escalate to actual nuclear conflict. Ellie felt a cold sensation spreading through her chest. "You're saying I found lost Cold War documents? Presidential contingency plans in case of nuclear war? That's the billion-dollar question, Ms. Morgan." Hayes met her gaze directly. "What you found appears to be authenticated presidential communications, but with anomalies that suggest something far more complex. The dates, the locations, even the presidential seal itself, they don't align with our historical records." Hayes manipulated the holographic display, bringing up images of one of the letters Ellie had found, magnifying the seal. This version of the presidential seal was never officially used. It contains subtle variations that our analysts are still attempting to decipher. "What are you saying?" Ellie asked, a creeping suspicion forming. "We believe what you've discovered are documents from what can only be described as an alternative historical timeline 1, where events following the Cuban Missile Crisis took a dramatically different path." Jack felt the weight of Hayes's words settling over him. "Alternative timeline," Like, from another reality. That sounds impossible. 24 hours ago, I would have agreed with you. But the metallurgical analysis of the containers, the carbon dating of the paper and ink, the cryptographic verification of the seals, they all confirm authenticity while simultaneously contradicting our historical record. The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch interrupted their conversation. One of Hayes's security team entered after a perfunctory knock, his expression urgent beneath his professional composure. "Ma'am, we've detected movement on the northern perimeter. Multiple heat signatures approaching through the forest using patterns consistent with tactical formation. Estimated time to property boundary, 8 minutes. Director Hayes stood immediately, her body language shifting from informational to operational. "Activate containment protocols. I want air support providing real-time tracking and perimeter teams in defensive positions. No engagement without explicit authorization." She turned to Ellie, her expression grave. "Miss Morgan, it appears your farm is about to become the convergence point for something unprecedented. I strongly recommend you allow us to evacuate you to a secure location immediately." Ellie rose from her chair, looking out the window toward the barn where the mysterious mail truck still rested. The rain had intensified again, reducing visibility to mere yards beyond the house. Somewhere out in that gray void, approaching through impossible conditions, were unknown forces with unclear intentions. "This is my home," she said finally, a lifetime of Morgan's stubbornness asserting itself. "My grandmother didn't abandon it during the flood of '78. My mother stood her ground during the wildfire of '96, and I'm not leaving because some secret government courier picked my land to crash on decades ago." She faced Hayes directly. "Besides, I found that truck. I have a right to know what happens next." Director Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Very well, but you'll follow security protocols precisely. Your survival now depends on it." She turned to her security officer. "Equip Ms. Morgan with tactical communications and a personal defense weapon. And bring the contents from the secure transport, all of it. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." As the officer departed to carry out her orders, Hayes fixed Ellie with an intense gaze. "Ms. Morgan, what happens in the next hour may fundamentally change our understanding of history and the nature of reality itself. The fact that you're witnessing it is both extraordinary and potentially catastrophic. I need your absolute cooperation if we're all going to survive what's coming." Ellie nodded, her mind racing to process everything she'd learned while simultaneously preparing for whatever unknown threat approached through the storm. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether her sheep had enough dry shelter to weather the deluge. Now she stood at the threshold of a reality far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. "Just tell me what I need to do," she said, moving to the window where Scout had begun growling softly, the dog's instincts already alerting to the approaching danger. Outside, military personnel moved with increasing urgency, deploying equipment and taking defensive positions around the property. In the distance, barely visible through the curtain of falling rain, strange lights flickered momentarily, colors that seemed to bend and shift in ways that light shouldn't, creating patterns that hurt Ellie's eyes when she tried to focus on them. "They're coming," Director Hayes said quietly, joining her at the window. "And they're not bothering to conceal their approach. That suggests either supreme confidence or desperate necessity." She checked her sidearm with practiced efficiency. Neither scenario typically ends well for bystanders. Ellie Morgan hadn't always been a sheep farmer in the remote wilderness of Colorado. At 38, the lines etched into her weathered face told the story of a woman who had seen more of the world than most would assume before returning to take over the family farm 5 years ago. She had served 8 years in the Army Intelligence Corps, including deployments to classified locations that still occasionally haunted her dreams. The transition from military intelligence specialist to struggling farmer hadn't been easy. After her mother's unexpected death from an aneurysm, Ellie had found herself the reluctant inheritor of 200 acres of challenging terrain, a small flock of heritage Navajo churro sheep, and a mortgage that seemed to grow despite her best efforts to reduce it. The fourth-generation Morgan property had once been prosperous, but changing climate conditions and rising costs had pushed it to the brink of insolvency. "Your tactical background explains a few things," Director Hayes remarked as she watched Ellie check the military-grade communication device her team had provided. Her hands moved with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had used similar equipment before. "Your file mentioned service but not intelligence operations. Some records stay deliberately incomplete," Ellie replied without looking up. "I'm surprised your people missed it in their background check." A ghost of a smile crossed the director's face. "Who says we missed it? Sometimes it's useful to observe how people handle information asymmetry." Before Ellie could respond, one of Hayes's technicians approached with a tablet displaying real-time sensor data. "Ma'am, the approaching signatures have split into 3 distinct groups. 2 maintaining direct approach, 1 circling to the eastern perimeter. Unusual energy readings from all 3. Hayes studied the display, her expression hardening. "They're coordinating. That's new." She turned to Ellie. "We need to move the contents from your barn to our mobile containment unit. Previous encounters suggest these entities can track specific quantum signatures at close range. The longer those materials stay in that location, the more precisely they can target them." Ellie reached for her heavy rain jacket. "I'll help. I know every inch of this property might keep things moving faster." As they prepared to venture out into the deluge, Ellie's mind drifted to her grandmother's stories about the property. Old Catherine Morgan had claimed there was something special about this particular valley, something that had led her to stake her claim here rather than in more fertile areas further south. She had spoken of unusual weather patterns, compasses that occasionally spun without explanation, and animals that behaved strangely during certain astronomical alignments. The family had dismissed these tales as the fanciful imagination of an isolated woman, or perhaps early signs of the dementia that would eventually claim her. But standing in her kitchen surrounded by government personnel responding to what appeared to be a cross-reality incursion, Ellie wondered if her grandmother had been more perceptive than anyone had realized. The rain hammered down in sheets as they made their way to the barn. The armed escort moving in tight formation around Hayes and Ellie, Scout stayed close to his mistress. His fur plastered to his body, eyes alert for any threat. Inside the barn, Ellie's discovery had been transformed. The mail truck was now enclosed in a sophisticated containment field, barely visible through a shimmering barrier that distorted light around its perimeter. A team of technicians in specialized hazmat suits worked methodically, cataloging and securing items from the vehicle. "Status report," Hayes demanded as they entered. One of the technicians straightened, holding what appeared to be one of the letters Ellie had discovered. "Preliminary authentication confirms our suspicions, Director. The documents are genuine presidential communications, but with historical divergences that indicate cross-timeline contamination. Carbon dating places the paper manufacture in 1963, but the microcrystalline structure shows quantum displacement patterns consistent with C theory." "C theory?" Ellie questioned. Hayes hesitated before responding. "Convergent event elasticity, a theoretical model suggesting that major historical events create pressure points in the timeline where alternate realities can occasionally intersect." "You're saying those letters come from a version of 1963 where history took a different path?" "That's our working hypothesis," Hayes nodded. "The assassination that occurred in our timeline 10 days after these letters were written may have been averted in theirs. The communications suggest preparations for continued governance under Kennedy through at least 1968, including initiatives that never existed in our historical record." The technician interjected with growing urgency. "Director, we've managed to access one of the sealed containers. It contains..." A massive explosion rocked the eastern perimeter of the property, cutting him off mid-sentence. The shock wave rattled the barn's timbers, sending dust and debris raining down from the rafters. "Breach in progress," a voice shouted over the tactical radio. "Eastern defensive line compromised. Multiple hostiles advancing." Hayes responded instantly. "Accelerate containment procedures. We need those materials secured for transport immediately." She turned to Ellie, her professional calm betrayed only by the tightness around her eyes. "Ms. Morgan, your knowledge of this terrain might be our only advantage. What's the fastest route to the western access road that could accommodate our transport vehicles?" Ellie's military training kicked in, her mind automatically mapping evacuation routes. "The old logging track behind the north pasture. It's rough but passable with the right vehicles. More importantly, it's hidden from aerial observation by the ridge canopy." "Perfect. I need you to guide our primary transport team while we establish a defensive perimeter." Hayes's tone made it clear this wasn't a request, but a critical mission assignment. As Ellie nodded her agreement, another explosion, closer this time, shook the ground beneath their feet. Through the barn doors, she caught glimpses of strange light patterns in the rain, not the tactical lights of Hayes's security team, but something else. Something that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around it. "They've breached the outer perimeter," Hayes stated flatly. "We have perhaps 15 minutes before they reach this position. Move the critical materials to the transport immediately." The team moved with practiced efficiency, loading the sealed containers and the leather messenger bag into specialized transport cases. Ellie noticed they handled the materials with extreme caution, as though the letters and containers might be unstable in some way beyond the merely physical. As they prepared to move out, the technician who had been interrupted approached Hayes with a tablet displaying an image that made the director's expression shift to something Ellie could only interpret as controlled alarm. "We've confirmed the contents of Container 3, he reported, his voice low. "It's exactly what we feared: command authorization codes for the alternate timeline's nuclear response network. Still potentially viable if the right infrastructure exists in parallel on our side." Hayes absorbed this information with a sharp nod. "Which explains their determination. If these codes could be adapted to our systems, it would bypass every security protocol we've ever implemented," the technician finished. "Our entire strategic defense network would be compromised." Hayes turned to Ellie. "The situation has escalated beyond our initial assessment. Those materials cannot fall into hostile hands under any circumstances. The implications for global security would be catastrophic." Another explosion, this one close enough to feel the heat, punctuated her statement. Through the driving rain, figures began to materialize at the edge of the property, human in basic outline but moving with an unsettling fluidity that struck Ellie as profoundly wrong. Their tactical gear resembled standard military equipment, but with subtle differences, technologies and configurations she'd never seen before. "Who are they?" Ellie asked, watching as Hayes's security forces engaged the intruders with weapons that emitted pulses of energy rather than conventional ammunition. "We don't know for certain," Hayes admitted. "Based on previous encounters, we believe they're specialized recovery units from the alternate timeline train to retrieve materials that have crossed between realities during convergence events. But their approach is more aggressive than we've ever encountered. They're not just trying to recover their property. They're trying to capture ours as well." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Hayes's forces had superior position and preparation, but the intruders had technology that seemed to counteract conventional defensive measures. Their movements suggested intimate knowledge of military tactics combined with capabilities that defied normal human limitations. "Time to move," Hayes ordered. Northern evacuation route. Ms. Morgan will lead the primary transport. Alpha team provides escort. The rest of us will maintain defensive positions to cover your withdrawal. As Ellie moved toward the waiting transport vehicle, Hayes caught her arm. These materials must reach our secure facility at all costs. If your convoy is compromised, you are authorized to implement Protocol Omega. She pressed a small device into Ellie's hand, a detonator of some kind. This generates a localized temporal implosion. It will erase the materials from both timelines permanently. Use it only as a last resort. The weight of this responsibility settled over Ellie like a physical burden. She was being entrusted not only with state secrets, but potentially with the safety of two different versions of reality. Understood, she said simply, pocketing the device. As they moved toward the northern edge of the property where the transport vehicles waited, the attack on the eastern perimeter intensified. Hayes's forces were fighting a tactical retreat, using the terrain and pre-positioned defenses to slow the intruders' advance. The strange energy weapons both sides deployed created bizarre distortions in the air, moments where reality itself seemed to ripple and bend. Scout kept pace beside Ellie, his instincts clearly on high alert as they navigated through the driving rain toward the waiting convoy. The dog's behavior had been increasingly unusual since the discovery of the mail truck, as though he was sensing aspects of the situation that human perception couldn't register. They reached the transport vehicles, 3 armored SUVs and a specialized truck with what appeared to be temporal shielding similar to what had surrounded the mail truck in the barn. The materials were quickly transferred to the secure compartment in the central vehicle under the watchful eyes of Hess's security team. "You'll ride point with me," the team leader told Ellie, gesturing to the lead SUV. "We need your guidance to navigate the logging track. Once we reach the main road, our extraction team will take over." As they prepared to depart, a massive explosion rocked the farmhouse. Ellie turned to see part of her family home engulfed in flames, Hayes's defensive forces falling back under intense pressure from the advancing intruders. For a moment, Ellie hesitated, watching her heritage burn. 4 generations of Morgans had lived and died in that house, their history written in the very timbers that were now feeding the inferno. The urge to return, to salvage anything of her family's legacy, nearly overwhelmed her mission focus. "Ms. Morgan," the team leader's voice cut through her anguish. "We need to move now." Director Hayes's orders were explicit. With a final glance at the burning remnants of her past, Ellie turned and climbed into the lead vehicle, Scout jumping in beside her. As the convoy began to move, following her directions toward the concealed logging track, she fought to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus on the critical task at hand rather than the personal loss she had just witnessed. The logging track was exactly as she had described, rough but navigable, concealed by dense forest canopy that would shield them from aerial observation. The convoy moved slowly, the heavy vehicle struggling for traction on the rain-soaked ground. In the rearview mirror, Ellie could see the glow of her burning home receding into the distance, a fiery beacon that marked the center of a conflict whose true scope she was only beginning to comprehend. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Scout's behavior changed dramatically. The dog, normally calm even in crisis situations, began growling fiercely, his attention fixed on something in the forest ahead that human eyes couldn't perceive. "Stop the vehicle," Ellie commanded, her instincts screaming warning. The driver hesitated only momentarily before complying, bringing the SUV to a halt in the middle of the narrow track. Behind them, the rest of the convoy followed suit, security personnel immediately establishing defensive positions around the vehicles. "What is it?" the team leader demanded, scanning the surrounding forest with enhanced optical equipment. "I don't know," Ellie admitted. "But Scout senses something. He's never wrong about threats." As if in response to her words, a section of the forest ahead began to shimmer, the air distorting in patterns similar to what she had observed around the mail truck. Trees, rocks, and underbrush seemed to phase in and out of solidity, as though reality itself was becoming malleable. Temporal distortion field, one of the security team reported, consulting a handheld sensor. Massive energy spike. Something's coming through. The team leader's response was immediate and decisive. Defensive perimeter. Temporal disruption protocols. Prepare for hostile contact. The security forces moved with practiced efficiency, deploying what appeared to be specialized countermeasures designed to stabilize reality against incursion. But the distortion continued to grow, expanding outward from a central point until it encompassed the entire width of the logging track directly in their path. Within this shimmering boundary, shapes began to materialize, first as indistinct shadows, then gradually solidifying into recognizable forms. Vehicles similar to their own but with subtle differences in design and technology. Armed personnel in uniforms that resembled U.S. military issue, but with insignia and configurations Ellie had never seen before. "Hold your fire," the team leader ordered as his forces brought weapons to bear on the materializing threat. "Defensive posture only until we confirm hostile intent." The standoff lasted several tense seconds, both sides assessing each other across the dimensional boundary. Then a figure emerged from the center of the opposing force, a woman whose bearing and authority mirrored Director Hayes's in every detail. She wore what appeared to be a high-ranking military uniform, though not from any branch Ellie recognized. The woman surveyed the convoy with calm precision before focusing her attention directly on Ellie. "I am Colonel Elizabeth Morgan, United States Temporal Defense Division," she announced, her voice carrying easily despite the rain and the strange distortion field surrounding her forces. "I believe you have materials that belong to my timeline." The shock of hearing her own name, spoken by this alternate version of herself, momentarily paralyzed Ellie. The resemblance was uncanny, the same features, the same posture, even the same scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood fall. Yet there were differences too. This version of herself carried herself with the hardened authority of someone who had never left military service. Someone who had risen through the ranks to command position rather than retreating to civilian life. Scout's reaction was equally startling. The dog had stopped growling and now stood alert but unthreatening, his head tilted in evident confusion as he processed the contradictory, sensory information of two versions of his mistress existing simultaneously. "Stand down, Colonel Morgan," the team leader responded, recovering quickly from his own surprise. "Those materials are under our protection by order of the United States government." "This timeline's government," he emphasized. Colonel Morgan's expression remained impassive. "I understand your position, but you fail to grasp the severity of the situation. Those communications contain sensitive information that could destabilize both our realities if misinterpreted or misused. They were never meant to cross the dimensional boundary." "That's not our assessment," the team leader countered. "Our analysts believe the materials pose no threat to timeline stability if properly contained and studied." "Your analysts are working with incomplete information," Colonel Morgan stated flatly. "The Cuban Missile Crisis in your timeline concluded with de-escalation. In ours, it triggered a limited nuclear exchange that reshaped global politics and technology development. The contingency plans in those communications were implemented, creating infrastructure that still exists in our reality, infrastructure that could be catastrophically affected by cross-dimensional interference." Ellie found her voice at last. "You're saying that in your reality, the Cuban Missile Crisis led to actual nuclear conflict? And you survived it?" Her alternate self turned to face her directly, a flicker of something like recognition crossing her features. "Limited exchange. 3 tactical weapons deployed by Soviet forces, 2 by American. The resulting geopolitical restructuring led to accelerated development in certain technologies, including the temporal monitoring systems that alerted us when your reality accessed our secure courier vehicle. The implications were staggering. Ellie was looking at a version of herself from a timeline where history had taken a dramatically different turn, where the Cold War had turned hot and apparently reshaped the very nature of scientific advancement. The team leader remained focused on the tactical situation. Regardless of your claims, our orders are clear. These materials remain under our jurisdiction until properly evaluated by our scientific division. Colonel Morgan's expression hardened. That is not acceptable. The longer these materials remain in your reality, the greater the risk of temporal contamination. Already, the convergence point is widening. Without proper containment protocols, both timelines could experience cascading reality failures. As if to emphasize her point, the distortion field surrounding her forces rippled violently, briefly revealing glimpses of yet another reality beyond one where the forest had never been cleared, where primeval wilderness stretched unbroken across what in Ellie's world was cultivated farmland. The team leader noticed it too, his expression betraying momentary concern before he reasserted his authoritative stance. Our containment technologies are more than adequate. He never finished the sentence. A massive explosion erupted from the rear of their convoy, engulfing the last vehicle in flames. From the trees on both sides of the logging track, new attackers emerged, the same forces that had assaulted Ellie's farm, now flanking their position with evident tactical coordination. Ambush! The team leader shouted, his forces immediately pivoting to engage the new threat. Colonel Morgan's reaction was equally swift. Defensive perimeter. Temporal stabilization at maximum. In the chaos that followed, Ellie found herself caught between three factions: Hayes's security forces, her alternate self's temporal division, and the mysterious attackers whose origins remained unclear. The logging track erupted in weapons fire, conventional ammunition mixing with energy pulses and distortion fields to create a battlefield unlike anything in standard military doctrine. Scout pressed close against Ellie's leg, his training keeping him calm despite the maelstrom of violence surrounding them. Through the confusion, Ellie focused on the central transport vehicle, which contained the materials both her alternate self and the unknown attackers seemed determined to acquire. A tactical decision crystallized in her mind, one from years of military intelligence training combined with the intimate knowledge of her family's land. There was a third route off the property, one not marked on any map, one her grandmother had shown her as a child. A narrow deer trail that led to an old mining tunnel system beneath the eastern ridge, eventually emerging miles away near the state highway. In the midst of the firefight, Ellie made her way back to the central transport vehicle. Its security detail was fully engaged with defending against the flanking attackers, creating a momentary opening. With Scout at her heels, she slipped into the secure compartment where the containers and messenger bag from the mail truck had been stowed. Working quickly, she transferred the critical materials to her own backpack, securing them as best she could while keeping the temporal detonator Hayes had given her within easy reach. If she couldn't escape with the materials, she could at least ensure they were removed from both timelines permanently. As she finished securing the backpack, a figure appeared at the vehicle's rear doors, Colonel Morgan, her alternate self. Weapon drawn but not aimed directly at Ellie. "That's not your burden to carry," she said quietly, her eyes tracking Ellie's movements with the precise assessment of someone intimately familiar with her own thought patterns. "Maybe not," Ellie acknowledged, slowly rising with the backpack secured. "But I know this land better than anyone, including you, apparently. Your timeline's version of this property must be different enough that you don't know about the tunnel system beneath the eastern ridge." A flicker of surprise crossed Colonel Morgan's face, confirmation that the divergence between their realities extended to geographical details as well as historical events. "The tunnels collapsed in our timeline during the seismic events following the limited exchange," she confirmed. "But that's irrelevant. Those materials need specialized containment that you can't provide." The temporal instability is increasing exponentially. Then help me, Ellie countered, a plan forming as she spoke. Neither of us wants those attackers to get hold of these documents. Work with me to get them to safety, and then we can discuss permanent disposition. Colonel Morgan assessed her for a long moment, weapons still ready but unpointed, clearly weighing tactical options against the larger strategic implications. The convergence point is collapsing, she finally said. Within hours, transition between our timelines will become impossible. If those materials aren't returned to their origin reality before that happens, the damage to the temporal membrane will be irreversible. Then we'd better move fast, Ellie replied, gesturing toward the eastern ridge barely visible through the rain and weapons fire. Scout and I can lead you to the tunnels. From there, we can evade pursuit and reach a secure location to make a final decision. For a moment, Ellie thought her alternate self would default to military protocol, and attempt to seize the materials by force. Instead, Colonel Morgan lowered her weapon slightly. "Your dog trusts you," she observed, watching as Scout remained steadfastly at Ellie's side, despite the chaos around them. In both timelines, that seems to be a constant. A particularly violent explosion rocked the convoy, briefly drowning out all other sounds and illuminating the scene in harsh light. When visibility returned, the unknown attackers had breached the defensive perimeter on the western flank, overwhelming Hayes' security forces through sheer numerical advantage. "We're out of time," Colonel Morgan stated, making her decision. "Lead the way to these tunnels of yours. My team will provide covering fire as long as possible." With Scout taking point, Ellie slipped from the transport vehicle and into the dense underbrush at the edge of the logging track, Colonel Morgan following close behind. Behind them, the battle continued to rage, buying precious minutes for their escape. Toward the eastern ridge were the entrance. To the tunnel system waited a narrow passage into darkness that might offer their only hope of safeguarding materials that had inexplicably crossed between realities, bringing with them secrets that could reshape the world in ways no one had anticipated. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Ellie remembered it, a narrow opening, partially concealed by rock outcroppings and dense undergrowth, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. Scout moved confidently toward it, his instincts unaffected by the chaos behind them or the strange reality-bending technology surrounding Colonel Morgan. As they reached the entrance, Ellie pulled away fallen branches that had accumulated since her last visit years ago. The passage was tight, requiring them to crouch as they entered the darkness of the old mining system. The sound of the battle behind them became muffled, then distant, as they moved deeper into the earth. "How far does this extend?" Colonel Morgan asked, activating a small device that cast a bluish glow ahead of them, illuminating the rough-hewn stone walls. "About 3 miles in total," Ellie replied, following Scout's confident lead. The main shaft runs east to west under the ridge, with smaller galleries branching north and south. "My grandmother showed me this place when I was 10. Said it was a Morgan family secret, a refuge in case of emergencies. In my timeline, this entire ridge was destroyed in '64, Colonel Morgan said, studying the tunnel with professional assessment. The seismic aftershocks from the Cuban exchange triggered massive geological instability throughout the Rockies. Your family property became part of a military containment zone." "And my family?" Ellie couldn't help asking. Colonel Morgan's expression revealed nothing. "Relocated under the National Emergency Resettlement Act. Your grandmother, our grandmother, refused to leave initially. Eventually had to be forcibly evacuated." The image of Catherine Morgan, stubbornly defying government orders to abandon her land, struck Ellie as perfectly consistent across realities. The old woman had possessed a fierce independence that bordered on defiance, a trait she had passed to her descendants in both timelines. As they moved deeper into the tunnel system, the unique mineral composition of the surrounding rock began to affect their equipment. The blue light from Colonel Morgan's device flickered erratically, and the tactical radio at Ellie's hip emitted only static. Signal degradation, Colonel Morgan observed, checking a small scanner on her wrist. But also something else. The quantum signatures from the documents are stabilizing. The mineral deposits in these walls are somehow dampening the temporal fluctuations. Ellie nodded. My grandmother used to say there was something special about the rocks here, that they remembered differently than rocks elsewhere. We all thought it was just another of her strange sayings, but she was recognizing something real, just lacking the scientific framework to express it properly, Colonel Morgan finished. These formations likely contain high concentrations of quantum-sensitive minerals that absorb chronon radiation. In my timeline, we mined similar deposits for temporal shielding materials. They continued in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their footsteps on the stone floor and Scout's occasional soft whine as he navigated ahead of them. The main tunnel gradually widened into what had once been a central mining gallery, a large chamber where ore processing had taken place a century earlier. Ancient timber supports, blackened with age, held back the mountain above, while rusted equipment stood as silent witnesses to human industry long abandoned. We should rest briefly, Ellie suggested, setting down her backpack carefully. Assess our situation and plan our next move. Colonel Morgan nodded agreement, her military training recognizing the tactical wisdom of regrouping before proceeding. She moved to the chamber's entrance, establishing a defensive position with clear sightlines along the tunnel they had traversed. No signs of pursuit yet, she reported. But we should assume both Hayes's people and the third faction are searching for us. The quantum signature of those documents will be partially masked by the mineral deposits, but not indefinitely. Ellie removed the messenger bag from her pack, handling it with care. You said these materials are from your timeline, that they need to be returned to prevent some kind of catastrophic reality failure. I need to understand exactly what that means. Colonel Morgan hesitated, then apparently decided full disclosure was necessary under the circumstances. The communications in that bag were drafted by President Kennedy 10 days before he was scheduled to be assassinated in Dallas, in both our timelines. The difference is that in your reality, that assassination succeeded. In mine, it was prevented by a Secret Service agent named Samuel Thornton. I've never heard that name, Ellie said, trying to recall her history lessons. You wouldn't have. He doesn't exist in your timeline. That's the divergence point, the moment our realities branched. In your world, Kennedy died, and history proceeded along the path you know. In mine, he lived, and what followed was dramatically different. Colonel Morgan moved closer, gesturing to the messenger bag. Those communications detail contingency plans Kennedy had developed in case tensions with the Soviet Union escalated again after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Plans that were never implemented in your timeline because of his death, but became the foundation of our post-exchange governance structure after the limited nuclear conflict in ours. And if these documents remain in my reality? Ellie asked, understanding beginning to dawn. Temporal contamination accelerates exponentially, Colonel Morgan explained. Already, the convergence point is widening. Small details from one timeline bleeding into the other. Without correction, the damage becomes irreversible. Eventually, catastrophic timeline collapse occurs. The end of both worlds, Ellie concluded grimly. Not just both potentially all-connected realities across the quantum spectrum. These letters aren't just historical artifacts. They're nexus points documents of such historical significance that they anchor entire causal chains. Their displacement creates instability that propagates outward through the multiverse. Scout's sudden alert posture interrupted their conversation. The dog's ears perked up, his attention focused on the tunnel behind them. Someone's coming, Ellie whispered, immediately dousing their light source. They moved silently into defensive positions on either side of the chamber entrance, weapons ready. Colonel Morgan deployed a small device that created what appeared to be a sensory dampening field around them, a precaution against advanced detection equipment. Minutes passed in tense silence. The darkness of the mining gallery, absolute, except for the faintest phosphorescence from mineral deposits in the walls. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, footsteps echoed from the main tunnel, a single person moving with cautious precision. A beam of light swept across the chamber entrance, followed by a familiar voice. "Ms. Morgan? I know you're in there. I'm alone, and I'm coming in unarmed." Director Hayes. Ellie exchanged a glance with Colonel Morgan, who nodded slightly, acknowledging the tactical assessment that Hayes likely was indeed alone, given the confident announcement of her approach. "Stop at the entrance," Ellie called out. "Hands where we can see them." Hayes appeared in the chamber entrance, her tactical light illuminating her raised hands. Her normally immaculate appearance had been replaced by the disheveled look of someone who had been through intense combat, uniform torn, face smudged with dirt and what appeared to be blood from a minor head wound. "You've led us on quite a chase," she said, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite her appearance. "Us?" Colonel Morgan questioned, weapon still trained on Hayes. "A manner of speaking," Hayes clarified. "My team has been decimated. Those who survived are establishing a defensive perimeter around the property, attempting to contain the temporal breach. I've come alone because this situation requires immediate resolution beyond standard protocols." Ellie studied Hayes carefully. "How did you find us?" "Your dog," Hayes nodded toward Scout. "My team deployed quantum resonance tracking calibrated to his unique signature after observing his sensitivity to the temporal anomalies. It was a calculated risk that he would stay with you rather than becoming separated in the chaos." Scout's ears flattened slightly at the mention of being tracked, as though the dog understood the implications of Hayes's explanation. "And the third faction? The attackers?" Colonel Morgan asked. Hayes's expression darkened. "Not from either of our timelines, as far as we can determine. Their technology and tactical approaches suggest an origin much further along the quantum spectrum, possibly a reality where the Cold War evolved into something far worse than either of ours experienced." She looked directly at the messenger bag Ellie had set on a nearby rock shelf. "They're after the same documents, but for different reasons. We believe they want to use the authentication codes and protocols contained within to access nuclear command systems across multiple realities simultaneously." "Why?" Ellie asked. "What purpose would that serve?" "Based on intercepted communications, we believe they're facing resource depletion in their home reality. They're seeking to orchestrate synchronized first strikes across multiple timelines, creating devastation that would allow for easier cross-dimensional resource extraction. The implications were staggering, a form of multiversal imperialism where entire realities would be sacrificed to sustain another. We have perhaps 20 minutes before they track us here," Hayes continued. "The mineral composition is delaying but not preventing their scanning technology from isolating our position." Colonel Morgan's tactical assessment was immediate and decisive. "Then we need to return these documents to my timeline immediately. The convergence point is already destabilizing. If those materials remain displaced when it collapses, the damage becomes permanent." Hayes nodded in agreement, surprising both Morgans with her ready acquiescence. "That was my conclusion as well, after analyzing the complete data from our scientific team. These letters need to return to their origin reality." She turned to Ellie. "Which is why I brought this." From her jacket, Hayes produced a small device similar to the temporal detonator she had given Ellie earlier, but with a more complex configuration. A portable transition gate. It can create a stable passage between converging timelines for approximately 90 seconds, enough time for Colonel Morgan to return with the documents. Ellie stared at the device, then at Hayes. "You had this capability all along? Why the military response, the containment protocols, everything else?" Standard procedure when temporal anomalies are detected, Hayes explained. Secure, analyze, then determine appropriate action. Until we understood exactly what we were dealing with, creating additional transition points would have risked exponential timeline contamination. She handed the device to Colonel Morgan, who examined it with professional interest. The technology is similar to our own, if somewhat less refined, she observed. It should work, assuming we can establish proper calibration to my reality's quantum frequency. Already programmed, Hayes assured her. We captured enough data during the earlier incursions to establish a precise targeting solution. As Colonel Morgan continued examining the transition device, Ellie found herself confronting an unexpected emotional response to the imminent resolution. Despite the clear necessity of returning the documents to their proper timeline, something about the entire scenario felt incomplete, as though a deeper truth remained unrevealed. There's something you're not telling us, she said, looking directly at Hayes. About my family's land. About why this convergence happened here, specifically. Hayes hesitated, clearly weighing operational security against the practical need for full disclosure. Your family property sits at what we call a thin point, a location where the quantum membrane between realities is naturally more permeable, she finally acknowledged. We've been monitoring it for decades. Your grandmother knew, at least partly. She was approached by a government team in 1965, after unusual radiation patterns were detected in the area. The stories she told, Ellie realized. The strange occurrences, the compasses spinning, animals behaving oddly, she wasn't imagining things. Hayes nodded. She was observing genuine quantum phenomena without the scientific context to properly interpret them. After the initial investigation, a monitoring station was established on the adjacent federal land. Your family was allowed to remain in place, partly to maintain cover for our operations, partly because your grandmother threatened to go public if forced to relocate. That sounds like Catherine Morgan, Colonel Morgan said with a hint of pride. Stubborn across all realities. More than stubborn, Hayes corrected. Perceptive. She recognized the special nature of this land intuitively, in ways our scientific instruments sometimes missed. Her observations formed the foundation of several breakthroughs in temporal physics. Without even realizing it, she was a pioneer in multiversal theory. This revelation cast Ellie's family history in an entirely new light. The grandmother she had sometimes dismissed as eccentric or superstitious had been perceiving fundamental truths about reality that science was only beginning to formalize. The Morgan family's deep connection to this land wasn't merely emotional or historical, it was quantum in nature, woven into the very fabric of multiple realities. A distant rumble interrupted their conversation, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. They're getting closer, Hayes warned. Using some kind of subsurface penetration technology to track us. We need to proceed immediately. Colonel Morgan finished her examination of the transition device and nodded. It's ready. I'll need the documents. Ellie reached for the messenger bag, but paused before handing it over. What happens after? To this reality, to my land? The convergence point will gradually stabilize once the temporal anomaly is removed, Colonel Morgan explained. Your reality will continue along its natural path, as will mine. The thin point will remain, but without active disturbance, the membranes between our worlds will strengthen. And the third faction? Ellie pressed. The ones trying to weaponize these documents? Without access to the authentication codes, their plan fails, Hayes said. They'll likely retreat to their origin reality once the convergence begins to collapse. My remaining forces have established a containment perimeter to ensure they don't attempt any last-minute incursions. Another, stronger rumble shook the mining gallery, dislodging small stones from the ceiling. Scout whined softly, pressing against Ellie's leg. Time to go, Colonel Morgan said, taking the messenger bag and securing it within her tactical vest. She activated the transition device, placing it carefully on a flat stone surface in the center of the chamber. The device hummed softly at first, then with increasing intensity as blue-white energy began to emanate from its core. The light expanded outward, forming a rippling portal approximately 6 feet in diameter. Through this shimmering gateway, Ellie could see what appeared to be the same mining chamber, but with subtle differences, the equipment more deteriorated. Support beams reinforced with unfamiliar technology, and what looked like permanent monitoring equipment installed along the walls. "That's my reality," Colonel Morgan confirmed, seeing Ellie's questioning look. "The transition appears stable." She turned to Ellie, and for the first time, the professional military demeanor softened slightly. "In my world, I never left service to return to the farm." Catherine Morgan had understood on some intuitive level what scientists were only beginning to formalize: that reality was not fixed but fluid, that history was not immutable but malleable, and that certain places existed where the boundaries between what might have been and what was grew thin enough to touch. The Morgan family had been guardians of such a place for generations, without fully comprehending its significance. Now, armed with that knowledge, Ellie would continue that legacy with clear purpose and understanding, a shepherd not just of sheep but of the delicate membrane between worlds. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across her property, Ellie Morgan turned and walked back into her rebuilt home, Scout faithfully at her heels. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new protocols to learn, new systems to monitor. But for tonight, she would simply be a farmer returning from her fields, keeping watch over the land that had defined her family for generations. Land that now connected her not only to her past but to countless alternate futures spreading outward across the quantum spectrum like ripples in a cosmic pond. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk that spoke of permanence and continuity. Inside, the house might contain new technology hidden beneath familiar surfaces, but it remained a Morgan home, point of stability in a universe of infinite possibilities. Seasons turned on the Morgan property with their ancient rhythm, untroubled by the knowledge that this particular stretch of Colorado mountainside bridged realities beyond human comprehension. Spring brought wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in vibrant purples and yellows. Summer filled the pastures with the soft bleating of lambs. Autumn painted the aspens gold against evergreen slopes. And winter draped everything in pristine white silence. Through it all, Ellie maintained her vigil tending her sheep, repairing fences, monitoring the sophisticated equipment disguised as ordinary farm implements, and filing her weekly reports through the secure channel Hayes had established. The government compound nestled in the north pasture became a familiar part of the landscape, its personnel rotating every few months, but always maintaining the cover of agricultural researchers studying high-altitude farming techniques. 3 years passed in relative peace. The convergence point remained stable, the quantum membrane between realities gradually strengthening as Hayes's scientists had predicted. Only occasionally did the monitoring equipment detect minor fluctuations, ripples in the cosmic fabric that Ellie had come to think of as echoes from distant worlds, brushing momentarily against her own. Scout, now showing the first silver hairs of middle age around his muzzle, maintained his uncanny sensitivity to these fluctuations. Sometimes he would stop suddenly during their morning walks around the property, ears perked and head tilted as though listening to voices Ellie couldn't hear. His gaze fixed on empty air that perhaps wasn't empty in some adjacent reality. On a crisp autumn morning, Ellie sat at her kitchen table reviewing the latest sensor readings when Hayes arrived unannounced. The director's visits had become increasingly rare as the immediate crisis receded and operations normalized, making her sudden appearance noteworthy. "You should have called ahead," Ellie remarked, pouring coffee into a second mug without being asked. "I would have made something better than day-old cornbread for breakfast." Hayes accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "This isn't a scheduled inspection." Something's happened that I thought you should hear in person, rather than through channels. The seriousness in her tone made Ellie set down her own mug carefully. Another breach? No, nothing like that. The membrane remains stable. Hayes reached into her jacket and withdrew a small metallic cylinder about the size of a lipstick tube. This came through yesterday during routine monitoring. It's what we call a quantum messenger designed to transmit small objects across stable dimensional boundaries without creating full convergence events. She placed the cylinder on the table between them. It's addressed to you. From Colonel Morgan. Ellie stared at the object, a complex mix of emotions washing through her. 3 years without contact from her alternate self, and now this, a message across realities. How is this possible? I thought communication between timelines was restricted to prevent contamination. It is, Hayes confirmed. Quantum messengers are reserved for critical situations only. The energy cost alone is prohibitive. Whatever she sent, she considered it important enough to justify the risk. With careful movements, Ellie picked up the cylinder. It felt oddly warm in her hand, almost alive, as though the journey between dimensions had imbued it with a subtle energy. A small depression at one end yielded to her thumb press, causing the device to split lengthwise with a soft hiss. Inside lay a single object, a faded photograph that Ellie immediately recognized, despite never having seen it before. A family portrait, formally posed. An older woman with stern features but kind eyes that matched Ellie's own. A middle-aged couple standing behind her. And at the center, a young girl in what appeared to be a military academy uniform, her posture already reflecting the disciplined bearing Ellie had observed in Colonel Morgan. "My family," she said softly. "Her family." From the other timeline. Hayes leaned forward to examine the image. The temporal markers suggest this was taken in 1972 in their reality, about 9 years after the limited nuclear exchange that altered their historical path. Ellie studied the faces, seeing familiar features arranged in unfamiliar configurations. The grandmother Catherine Morgan in both timelines looked harder than in Ellie's memories, the lines in her face deeper, but with the same unbending determination in her eyes. The parents were strangers to Ellie. In her reality, her father had died before she was born, and her mother had raised her alone until her own passing 5 years ago. But it was the young girl who captured her attention most completely, another Elizabeth Morgan, perhaps 12 years old. Already set on the path that would lead her to become Colonel Morgan of the Temporal Defense Division. Her expression serious beyond her years, shoulders squared in the way military children often adopt early, unconsciously mimicking the adults around them. "There's something else," Hayes noted, pointing to what appeared to be handwriting on the back of the photograph. Ellie turned it over carefully. In precise handwriting that she recognized as a more disciplined version of her own. A short message was inscribed. "Catherine Morgan died yesterday. Age 97. Last words, tell my other granddaughter the land remembers. Property now military research facility. Bloodline continues through my daughter, Catherine Elizabeth, age 7. Convergence point stable. Coordinates for emergency contact enclosed if needed. Be well across the divide. M." Beneath this message was a complex numerical sequence that Ellie assumed represented the quantum coordinates Hayes's scientists would need if cross-dimensional communication ever became necessary again. 97, Ellie said quietly. She lived longer there than here. Her own grandmother had passed at 86, still fiercely independent to the end. Different medical technologies developed after their limited exchange, Hayes explained. Radiation treatments accelerated certain aspects of their medical science. But Ellie was focused on a different detail. She had a daughter. I have a niece, in a way. Catherine Elizabeth. Hayes nodded. Named for your grandmother, apparently. And for you, Elizabeth. The bloodline continues, Ellie murmured, echoing the message. The Morgan connection to the land extends into another reality. The implications settled around her like gentle snow. Another Morgan child growing up in a world where this mountain property had become a military research facility rather than a working farm. Where global history had taken a dramatically different turn after nuclear weapons were actually deployed in the Cuban conflict. Where technology had developed along altered paths driven by different necessities. Yet despite these profound divergences, certain constants remained: the Morgan name, the connection to this specific piece of earth, and most strikingly, her grandmother's final message bridging realities. "Tell my other granddaughter the land remembers." She knew, Ellie said, setting the photograph down carefully. In both timelines, she understood something about this place that went beyond scientific explanation. Something fundamental. Hayes didn't dismiss this assessment as she might have years earlier. Her experience with the convergence event and subsequent monitoring had apparently opened her to possibilities beyond strict empirical frameworks. "Your grandmother was perceptive in ways our instruments still can't fully quantify," she acknowledged. "Some of our theoretical physicists have begun studying what they call intuitive quantum awareness, the ability certain individuals seem to have to sense multiverse connections without technological assistance." Scout, who had been dozing by the wood stove, suddenly lifted his head and stared intently at the kitchen doorway, ears forward, body tensing slightly. Both women followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. "He's doing it again," Ellie observed, sensing something across the divide. Hayes checked her portable scanner, which showed minor fluctuations in the quantum field, nothing concerning, just the normal background variations they'd come to expect. "Dogs may have sensory capabilities that evolved differently from ours," she suggested, "less restricted by the cognitive frameworks that limit human perception to single timeline awareness." Ellie rose and moved to scratch behind Scout's ears reassuringly. "What do you see, boy? Someone visiting from the other side?" For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine Colonel Morgan standing in that doorway in some adjacent reality. Perhaps with her young daughter, visiting the spot where the family home had once stood in their timeline. The thought wasn't frightening or disturbing, merely a quiet acknowledgement of paths not taken, of lives unfolding in parallel across an infinite cosmic tapestry. "I'd like to keep the photograph," Ellie said, returning to the table. "The quantum messenger too, if possible." Hayes considered this request. "The messenger should return to the research division for analysis, but I see no security concerns with you keeping the photograph. It contains no technological information that could cause contamination issues." She hesitated before continuing. "There is something else I should mention. The funding allocation for this monitoring station comes up for review next month. Some elements in Washington are questioning the need for continued observation given the stability of the convergence point over the past 3 years. Ellie felt a sudden tightness in her chest. They're considering shutting down the operation? Scaling back, at minimum. Perhaps transitioning to automated monitoring with quarterly rather than constant staffing. Hayes's tone remained professional, but Ellie detected an undertone of disagreement with this potential decision. Budget constraints are being cited, but there's also a new administration with different priorities. And my role in all this? Would continue, but with reduced support and oversight. You'd maintain your security clearance and reporting obligations, but with fewer resources. Hayes met her gaze directly. I've argued against this reduction, emphasizing the unique properties of this location and the value of your family's historical connection to the site. Ellie nodded, appreciating the support while recognizing the realities of shifting government priorities. When will you know? Final decisions should come through within 6 weeks. I'll inform you immediately, of course. After Hayes departed, Ellie spent the remainder of the day in a contemplative mood, moving through her chores with practiced efficiency while her mind processed the morning's revelations. The photograph remained on the kitchen table, a tangible connection to a reality she had glimpsed only briefly during the convergence crisis. That evening, as sunset painted the western mountains in fiery oranges and deep purples, Ellie made a decision. Taking a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, a simple, hand-carved container that had held the old woman's most treasured possessions, she carefully placed the photograph inside. Alongside other family mementos, her mother's wedding ring, her own military service medal, and a smooth river stone her grandmother had always carried for luck and remembering. She added one more item, a carefully folded piece of paper on which she had written her own message. A response to Colonel Morgan that might never be delivered, but needed to be expressed nonetheless. The land remembers here too. Your daughter carries our grandmother's name and our shared blood. I hope she knows the stories, even if the place has changed. Scout still senses the divide some days. I think he sees you. Morgan women endure across all worlds. Be well across the divide. And the box went onto the highest shelf in her bedroom, not hidden but set apart, a physical repository of cross-dimensional family history that bridged realities in its small way. 6 weeks later, Hayes returned with the news Ellie had been anticipating. The monitoring station would indeed be scaled back to automated systems with quarterly maintenance visits. The research team would be reassigned, the compound repurposed primarily for equipment housing rather than personnel quarters. You'll have your property mostly to yourself again, Hayes noted as they walked the boundary between the compound and Ellie's active pasture land. Though you'll still be a contracted observer with security clearance and reporting duties. Will the land be safe? Ellie asked, her primary concern not for bureaucratic adjustments, but for the quantum membrane that separated her reality from others. All indications suggest the convergence point has stabilized permanently, Hayes assured her. The dimensional boundaries have thickened considerably over these 3 years. Our theoretical models predict no significant risk of spontaneous reopening. They paused at the highest point of the pasture, looking back over the property. The government installation, despite its scientific purpose, had begun to weather into the landscape, its structures taking on the patina that all human constructions acquired in this mountain environment, a gradual integration into the natural world that softened their artificial origins. I'll miss the activity, in some ways, Ellie admitted. It's been interesting having different minds around after years of solitude. Hayes smiled slightly. You'll still have quarterly visits from maintenance teams. And I'll continue to serve as your primary contact, though my role is changing as well. I've been appointed to head a new division focused on theoretical applications of cross-dimensional physics. Moving up in the world, Ellie observed. Moving sideways, perhaps. Into areas with more questions than answers. Hayes's expression became more thoughtful. Working here has changed how I understand reality. Before the convergence event, I saw the world as fixed, singular, governed by immutable laws. Now you see the possibilities, Ellie finished. The paths not taken that exist somewhere else. The choices that branch into entire universes. Exactly. It's humbling and expanding at once. They completed their circuit of the property in companionable silence. Each woman contemplating the strange journey that had brought them together, a military intelligence officer turned sheep farmer and a government director of classified operations, united by their shared experience of witnessing realities through complexity. As spring turned to summer, the monitoring compound gradually emptied of personnel, the buildings secured and systems automated according to Hayes's plan. Ellie adjusted to the renewed solitude, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of farm life and the weekly check-ins with the automated monitoring equipment that had become just another part of her routine maintenance. She began keeping a journal, a careful record of Scout's reactions to invisible quantum fluctuations, of unusual weather patterns, of moments when she herself felt something akin to her grandmother's intuitive awareness, of this land's special properties. The journal never mentioned specific classified details that might cause security concerns, but it preserved observations that might otherwise be lost to fading memory. On the anniversary of the convergence event, Ellie made a pilgrimage to the eastern ridge where the mining tunnel entrance had once been. The collapse following Colonel Morgan's departure through the transition portal had permanently sealed that passage, burying the chamber where realities had momentarily touched beneath tons of rock and earth. Scout accompanied her, showing no hesitation at approaching the site despite his continued sensitivity to quantum phenomena. Perhaps, Ellie thought, the dog understood better than any human that boundaries between worlds were neither absolute nor permanent, that reality was fluid rather than fixed, possibilities rather than certainties. At the collapse site, she left a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from her grandmother's favorite meadow. Not in mourning, but in acknowledgement, a simple gesture across dimensions to honor connections that transcended conventional understanding. That night, sitting on her porch as stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Ellie opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote, "The Morgan land remembers its past and its parallel selves. It holds the echoes of choices made and unmade, of history that flowed along different channels in different worlds. My grandmother knew this without instruments or theories. She felt it in her bones, as I'm beginning to feel it in mine. Today I honored the connections between worlds with flowers at the tunnel entrance. In some adjacent reality, perhaps Colonel Morgan did the same, bringing her daughter to visit the place where our families diverged and reconnected. Perhaps little Catherine Elizabeth Morgan is learning about her multiversal heritage, about the aunt who exists as another version of her mother across the dimensional divide. The science tells us the convergence point is stable, the membranes between realities strengthening. But Scout still stops sometimes, head tilted, seeing or sensing visitors from elsewhere. And occasionally, in certain lights or at particular moments, I feel it too, a brush of alternative possibility, a whisper of what might have been that somewhere, somehow is. This is the true inheritance of the Morgan women, not just this land, but the awareness of its place in the greater cosmic tapestry. We are guardians of a junction point between worlds, keepers of a threshold most never perceive. The responsibility passes down through blood and bone, through intuition and observation, through the quiet acknowledgement that reality is vaster and stranger than humanity has words to express. The land remembers, and so do we. Years continued to pass. The automated monitoring systems functioned as designed. The quarterly maintenance visits became routine, and Hayes's occasional personal checks evolved into friendly social calls as much as professional oversight. Ellie's sheep prospered, her financial situation stabilized, and the Morgan property settled into a new equilibrium, part working farm, part classified government installation, all existing in harmony. Scout eventually grew old and passed peacefully in his sleep at the respectable age of 15, leaving Ellie to mourn the faithful companion who had shared her journey across converging realities. She buried him on the highest point of the property, with a simple marker bearing his name and the words, "He saw beyond." 6 months later, she adopted a new Australian shepherd puppy from a neighboring farm, a female with unusual eyes. One blue and one brown, whom she named Echo, to Ellie's quiet amazement, but not surprise. The puppy soon demonstrated the same sensitivity to quantum fluctuations that Scout had possessed, sometimes stopping to stare at empty doorways or barking at invisible visitors from adjacent timelines. On Echo's first birthday, Ellie received a rare delivery through official channels, a small package from Hayes, containing another quantum messenger. This one had apparently arrived with considerably less energy disruption than its predecessor, suggesting advances in the technology on Colonel Morgan's side of the divide. Inside was a single item, a pressed wildflower identical to those Ellie had left at the tunnel entrance years earlier. Accompanied by a note in familiar handwriting, "Catherine Elizabeth begins university studies in quantum physics this autumn. She chose the field after hearing family stories. The land remembers, and so do our children. Boundaries thin on certain dates. Flowers received and reciprocated. Be well across the divide. Ellie added this message to the wooden box alongside the photograph and her own undelivered note, creating a small archive of cross-dimensional family history. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "The Morgan bloodline continues in two realities, now linked by more than just shared origins." Young Catherine Elizabeth studies the science of what her great-grandmother intuited and what her mother and aunt experienced firsthand. The circle closes, knowledge passing from intuition to experience to formal study, the wisdom of the past informing the discoveries of the future. Echo senses the thinning boundaries, just as Scout did. The land remembers, the animals perceive, and the Morgan women understand. Some inheritances transcend single realities, flowing through blood and bone across the cosmic tapestry where all possibilities exist simultaneously. We are never truly separate from those other selves, those lives unlived in this reality, but fully experienced in others. We are quantum beings in a quantum multiverse, constantly brushing against alternate versions of ourselves across gossamer membranes of possibility. The mail truck that emerged from a landslide brought more than lost documents from another timeline. It delivered understanding. Not just of parallel histories or divergent choices, but of the fundamental nature of existence itself. We are all connected, all echoing through infinite variations, all part of a greater whole that encompasses every path taken and not taken. This is the true legacy of the Morgan land. Not the sheep or the timber, or even the monitoring station with its sophisticated equipment. The legacy is awareness, the recognition that reality is fluid rather than fixed, that boundaries are permeable, and that some truths can only be intuited rather than measured. The land remembers. The bloodline continues. The knowledge deepens across generations and dimensions. And in that understanding lies a quiet peace, the recognition that nothing is ever truly lost, merely experienced differently across the infinite branches of cosmic possibility. As sunset painted the western mountains in familiar gold and crimson, Ellie Morgan stood on her porch with Echo at her side, surveying the property that had been in her family for generations. To any passing stranger, it would appear to be nothing more than a modestly successful mountain farm with some unusual outbuildings. None would suspect its significance as a junction point between realities, a place where the cosmic membrane had momentarily parted to reveal the true complexity of existence. Ellie preferred it that way. Some truths weren't meant for scientific papers or government reports, but for quiet acknowledgement and careful stewardship. Catherine Morgan had understood that. Elizabeth Morgan, in this reality, and others understood it too. And someday, perhaps, Catherine Elizabeth Morgan would visit from her reality and stand on this same porch, completing a circle of understanding that transcended the boundaries between worlds. The land would remember. The bloodline would continue. And the legacy of the Morgan women would extend outward across the quantum spectrum, echoing through realities like ripples in a cosmic pond, touching shores they would never see, but that existed nonetheless in the infinite tapestry of all possible worlds. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.